Hello and welcome to this Talks at Google. My name is Jeremy Strickland. By way of quick introduction, I am the go-to-market partner for the multi-channel sales division within ALCS. In this role, I cover or help support our leaders in the search, shopping, and measurement and attribution fields. That's enough about me. We're all here to hear from Professor Loran Nordgren today. Loran is a best-selling author and professor of management and organizations at the Kellogg School of Management, my alma mater. A former Fulbright scholar, Loran has twice received Kellogg's Management Teacher of the Year Award and is a 6-time recipient of Kellogg's Teaching Impact Award. His research, as wide-ranging and impressive as it is, has been published in leading journals such as Science, and his ideas are regularly discussed in prominent forums such as the Harvard Business Review and other notable podcasts. As a practitioner, Loran has worked with numerous companies throughout the world on a wide range of behavior change problems, a process that he calls behavioral design. He recently co-authored a best-selling book, The Human Element, which I have my copy right here. I just finished reading it over the Thanksgiving break and would highly recommend that you grab a copy as well. Very quickly, I first met Professor Nordgren in the fall of 2016, where I took his Leadership in Organizations course. This course had a profound impact on me. It continues to serve, or the lessons continue to serve, as a roadmap for leading more effective meetings, helping to guide others to my viewpoint, and ultimately motivating my team and colleagues. With that, I am thrilled to introduce Loran for this talk at Google. Loran, over to you.
Jeremy, thank you so much for the kind words. Hello, everybody. It is wonderful to be with you today. So when a 270 Winchester rifle cartridge like this is fired from a gun, it's traveling at roughly 3,000 feet per second, breaking the sound barrier, and it can travel for nearly 2 miles. But a bullet like this isn't just powerful, it's equally precise. In a steady hand, a bullet will strike its target with pinpoint accuracy time and again. Now, the question that we have posed, my co-author and I, to thousands of people over the last 2 years is, what is it that enables such a technologically simple device to achieve such extraordinary power and precision? And when we ask that question to people, you will find that there is an instinctive, intuitive answer. The near universal answer to that question of what makes a bullet fly is gunpowder. And the reason why people say gunpowder is because when gunpowder ignites, it expands, creating tremendous pressure inside the barrel of a gun. And the only way for that pressure to be released is to push the bullet out the end of the barrel. So gunpowder, therefore, isn't the wrong answer to this question of what is it that makes a bullet fly, but it is a woefully incomplete answer. Woefully incomplete because anytime an object takes flight, be it a bullet, an airplane, a pitcher's fastball, there are two opposing forces at play. There are forces that fuel the object forward, that give it thrust. Things like gunpowder, a jet engine, or a pitcher's arm. But there are also forces that oppose forward progress. Namely, think gravity and wind resistance. For a bullet, the principal obstacle to flight is wind resistance or drag. That's because the faster an object moves, the more drag it encounters. In other words, if we start adding more gunpowder to the bullet, we simply increase more drag. So gunpowder helps us understand a bullet's initial exit velocity, but the reason a bullet is able to fly so far and so true is because it's aerodynamic. It's been optimized to reduce the principal friction operating against it. Our time together today, we are going to explore the question, what is it that enables new ideas, new innovations, new concepts, new social movements? What enables them to succeed? What enables them to get off the ground? And we will find that this metaphor around a bullet or more specifically, people's intuitions about what makes a bullet fly, is useful for understanding the central message today. Like a bullet, when we launch a new idea, there are two opposing forces at play. There are forces that give the idea thrust. We refer to these forces as fuel. The job of fuel is to elevate appeal. Uh, adding uh, adding a new feature to your product that's designed to elevate appeal, that's fuel. Refining the look and feel of a product, that elevates appeal, that's fuel. Using emotional appeals, incentives, etc. All of that is designed to add magnetism to the idea. All of that is fuel. The job of fuel is to incite our desire to change. Uh, but like an object, when we launch new ideas, there are also forces, these are psychological forces that oppose new ideas. And we refer to these forces as friction. And although we don't often see them, they are there acting as drag on innovation. Now, the central message of today is that when people, leaders, innovators, anyone trying to bring new ideas into the world, most people tend to operate on a deep assumption. It is assumption, I would argue, that is so deeply entwined in our human nature, we rarely see it or understand its consequences. We believe that the way you sell a new idea is by elevating appeal to add fuel. Our instinctive belief is that if we make the idea appealing enough, if we increase, elevate excitement, attraction, magnetism, eventually people will say yes to us, our ideas and initiatives. We also think that if people are rejecting our offer, it's because fuel is insufficient. We refer to this habit of the mind as thinking in fuel or holding a fuel-based mindset. Now, fuel, of course, is necessary for our ideas. Without excitement, without appeal, without logic, data, rationale, functionality behind our ideas would be inert. But in our fixation on fuel, we tend to neglect the other half of the equation, the frictions that oppose new ideas. Now, I'd like to share two case studies that I think speak to the problems of a fuel-based mindset. So in essence, our big picture idea is that when you are trying to create a new idea, when you're trying to launch a new change initiative, when you're trying to get people to buy into your new product, whatever this change may be, much like a bullet, our habit is to think solely in terms of how do we fuel, how do we amplify our idea or our message. And that's necessary. But our point today is we also want to think about how do we make our ideas aerodynamic. Let's look at two cases, and I hope to draw you in through comments in the chat. These two cases, I think, speak to the problems of a fuel-based mindset and also reveal the promise of thinking in terms of frictions or building more aerodynamic ideas. So the first case is what we might call the case of the disappearing customer. My co-author, David Schonthal, and I were approached by a company with a problem. We'll call this company Beach House. And Beach House is a startup that's they sell furniture, principally sofas, and they target urban millennials. In essence, these are people buying their first piece of adult furniture. And the idea, the promise of value of Beach House is that you can buy a fully customized sofa. It is a sofa designed to your precise, exact specifications, the dimensions, the legs, the furnishings, every element of this is fully customizable. And this has a lot of appeal. People love spending hours in the showroom or online designing the perfect one-of-a-kind sofa for them. But Beach House kept running into this mysterious problem. These would-be clients, these people who spent hours seemingly quite excited, engaged, building their sofa, something funny would happen right before they click purchase? Nothing. They would just disappear. Beach House, in other words, has uh, a conversion problem. Now, Beach House believes that the reason people aren't converting is because it must have to do with fuel, like the fuel is insufficient. So their first thought was, well, maybe what we need to do is lower the price. Lowering the price would elevate the appeal. That's a fuel-based solution. Maybe we need to, maybe the issue is the quality of our product, our finishes. Maybe if we elevate that product, that will elevate appeal and eventually they'll buy. That's a fuel-based solution. Maybe we need to refine the in-store, the showroom experience. These are all fuel-based solutions. Now, it turns out all those attempts didn't move the needle. When my colleague, the design and ethnography expert David Schonthal, sat down with these disappearing customers, what we came to find out is that fuel wasn't the issue at all. There was a friction standing in the way of the choice they wanted to make. Now, I wonder if you have any thoughts. I'm hoping, let's give this a shot in the comments. What are some of the frictions that might have stood in the way of the decision, the purchase they wanted to make? Can I see those? Any thoughts of what are the frictions standing in the way? Let me see. Am I seeing comments? I am not seeing comments, so I will um, uh, go forward. Aha, now here we are. Beautiful, beautiful. This is so much, otherwise, it's so lonely here. Being able to try it out, that uncertainty might be a friction. Price might be it, although it turns out that was not actually it. Concerns about delivery. So maybe it's coming from Italy and it's a 15-week process, and that's just simply too much for others. Uh, Other things, what are some other frictions that might be getting? Do I really need it? Aha, so perhaps there's excitement, but they're not sure that it's an actual need. That could be the issue standing in the way. So it turns out there were many potential. How would it look in my home? Aha. So maybe people have difficulty. They like it in on a screen, but they have difficulty thinking about how will this be once it's physically here in the home. That's maybe a mental friction standing in the way. There were many potential frictions, but the one we heard again and again, people didn't know what to do with their existing sofa. Think about it. So their status quo is not sitting on the floor. These people have existing sofas. They were probably the really awful college futons. Now it's their first professional job, and they realize it's time to upgrade. But right before, what we would hear again and again is people would realize, uh, right before they click purchase, this practical implementation concern would arise, which is, I can't buy this uh, until I figure out what to do with my existing sofa. And that would lead to questions like, can I physically move it? Uh, More importantly, though, it was questions like, am I able to just bring it down to the trash in my high-rise condo? Many people had the belief that there's in fact this special big trash day, and then some people would talk about a skepticism about whether this city of Chicago service would be reliable or easy to work with. Notice uh, all those fuel-based approaches, solutions, in no way help people with the problem that they have. Uh, Now, if you are Beach House, now that you understand what the friction is, what is the obstacle standing in the way, I'd love to see in the comments, how would you solve this problem? Once you see that this is a friction-based problem, not a insufficient fuel-based problem, how would uh, how would you solve this problem? How would you remove these disappearing customers? Let's see what you've got in the chat. What would you do? Yes, the way they solved this problem is offer to make clear upfront, signal that, by the way, if you have a sofa that you would like removed, we can do that at time of delivery. And the moment they made that change, this conversion problem largely evaporated. Let's look at a parallel case. So was working with someone in the military recruitment. I believe this was the Army, and he shared this story. So much like Beach House, the U.S. Army recruitment uh, office faced a similar problem. So they were recruiting principally high school, junior, seniors of high school, and they would get these seemingly excited would-be recruits. Uh, they would be proactive in setting up the meetings with the recruiters. They would come back for follow-ups. You could just see in their eye that they were excited about the promise of military life. But they too, something would happen. They would be given the enlistment form, and then they would simply disappear. And the US Army too felt that this problem was rooted in insufficient fuel. So they launched this huge multi-million-dollar TV and online web campaign showing all the promise of military life. And for the right person, military life is a highly fueled endeavor. Uh, it was highlighting the patriotism, excitement, exploration, see the world, camaraderie, meaning, and for some, a path to professional opportunity. But this too, it helped bring some people in, but did not help with this disappearing would-be recruiters. It turns out it too, this problem was rooted in a friction, an obstacle standing in the way of people who wanted to enlist. What do you think? Like, if you're a junior in high school and you see promise in military life, what might be an obstacle that stands in the way of you actually enlisting? What do you think? Yes, so there are many potential frictions here. One is would be perhaps fear, the size of commitment. I see family support. Aha, but Beth Kelly, you've got it. The thing they heard again and again, people, these would-be recruits, these junior seniors of high school, they were terrified to tell their parents. Think about it. If you were 17, 18 years old, what is required of you in this moment? What is required of you in this moment is for perhaps the first time in your life to initiate a serious conversation. You have to say, after dinner, I'd like to call a family meeting, and you have to explain to them this monumental choice you have just made. And although they found this idea attractive, compelling, um, uh, ultimately, for many, the fear of having that conversation, that anxiety, that uncertainty was a barrier they could not overcome. Now, think about if you are the US Army, how, once you have that insight, how do you solve for that problem? The realization is that you don't solve this problem through fuel. Like, these people already find the idea appealing and attractive. The way you solve this problem is to help people with the true problem they really have. If you look at ads today, increasingly you will see they speak less to the would-be recruiter, but instead the parent. And now what a recruiter will do is offer to give people scripts to show them, here is how you have this conversation, offer to be a part of this conversation, or even help initiate this conversation. And that approach has been a whole lot more successful. Uh, what I think we are seeing in these two examples is some of the promise of shifting our attention away from our fixation on fuel and beginning to think about spotting the friction that holds our ideas back. Because the human mind naturally fixates on fuel, it is important, but it tends to be the overexploited resource. Often the opportunity, the untapped resource, is in the blind spot, the thing we don't think about or see. These are the frictions standing in the way. So what I'd like to do in the time remaining, and then we'll jump into questions, I'd like to dig into, give you a little more detail about what we mean by friction. And then I'd like to show you some of the promise and strategy about what if we start creating change, bringing new ideas into the world through a friction-based mindset rather than a fuel-based mindset. So a way to understand friction is to think about the basic structure of a new idea, innovation, change initiative, any new thing we want to bring into the world. Uh, so any new idea has four basic elements, and each of these elements has a corresponding friction. So the first element of any idea is what degree of change does the idea represent? Are we talking a radical departure from the status quo, or is this a slight tweak on what we've known? The answer to that question will determine the extent to which our first friction, what we'll call inertia, inhabits our idea. Inertia captures this aspect of human behavior that says that humans prefer the familiar to the unfamiliar, even when the unfamiliar idea has clear benefits. Uh, so the first dimension of the first friction can be understood by thinking about what is the degree of change. Huge change, seismic change, uh, that means there is likely greater resistance to the idea. Secondly, all ideas have some cost of implementation. So sometimes that's easy, it's just a slight tweak. Far more often, particularly in things like internal change initiatives, the implementation cost is considerable. So we have to develop new schedules, break old habits, learn new routines. The greater the cost of implementation, the greater the second friction is what we call effort. Effort captures the idea that humans, as we'll see a little bit later on, humans are highly sensitive to effort expenditure. The more effortful the change, the more resistance we will encounter. This was the friction working against people in the beach house case. The third element of an idea is what reaction does it produce? So what we want is we want our new ideas, our products, our innovations to have positive reactions. We want it to instill excitement, hope, and confidence. But often our very best ideas can create unintended negative reactions. It's what we call emotional friction. And this is what we saw in the Army recruitment case. The fear of having that conversation is what held people back. And finally, the fourth dimension of an idea speaks to the relationship between the innovator and the audience. And the central question here is, does the audience, have they arrived at this idea on their own? Do they feel as though this is their decision to embrace change, or do they feel pressured to change? And the extent to which they feel pressured to change captures the degree of reactance that inhabits our innovations and ideas. Reactance captures this aspect of human behavior, which states that when people feel pressured to change, our natural instinct is to fight back against change. So, the first step from thinking in terms of not just fuel, but also understanding the frictions and anticipating the frictions that inhabit our ideas is when you're thinking about bringing change into the world, you might try and diagnose the frictions that might inhabit your idea. I've developed something, David and I have developed something called a friction report. You can find it online. I'm happy. It's a free tool to share. So step one is really thinking about what are the frictions. Once we have identified which frictions are present in the idea, so in the beach house case, it was principally an effort-based friction. In the Army recruitment case, it was principally an emotion-based friction. Now we have to turn our attention to solving for those frictions to build more aerodynamic ideas. So in doing this, I'll share one approach of many for building more aerodynamic ideas, and then I'm excited to hear about your thoughts and questions. Um, let's introduce this maybe in an unexpected way. So have always been fascinated with word origins, the history of words. As you can imagine, it makes me a very compelling conversationalist at cocktail parties. And one of my favorite word origins is the word goodbye. So the word goodbye has an interesting history. So you see it first emerge in written form in England in around the 1500s, and it was first emerged not as a word but rather a phrase. And the phrase had the same meaning roughly that it has today. It was the phrase "God be with ye," and you'd say this to someone to bid them farewell. Now, if you fast forward 100 years, you see this four-syllable phrase begin to truncate in written form. By the 1600s, it now is the three-syllable "God be ye." In the United States, by the 1900s, it begins to take on its contemporary form of "good hyphen by." Uh, it depends on regionally, but somewhere around the 1950s, 60s, dropping the hyphen becomes customary. And what is this word today? As far as I can tell, we have cut all the fat off this expression. I guess maybe "buh" is where we're going next. Now, in this example, we are seeing what I would argue is the most profound force operating on human behavior. It is a force that somehow or another gets very little attention, but I would argue it is the most profound force operating on human behavior. What we are seeing is what we might call the effort principle or the path of least effort. And this captures the idea that humans are highly sensitive, highly attuned to effort expenditure. To show you that, I have a little surprise. Jeremy didn't mention this, but customarily, this is an hour talk. I've got good news. This is, in fact, going to be a 3-hour talk today. Now, think what was your first reaction to that news? Your first reaction was not, "Wonderful. Think about all the value we will create in another 2 hours." Your first thought was, "Oh my God, I'm not giving this guy an extra 2 hours." Like, what is, if we are being really sincere, what is the number one goal of basically every meeting we have ever been in? To get out of the meeting. Humans are highly sensitive to effort expenditure. In fact, this is not human specific. Like most of the ideas here, we share this with primates and the rest of the mammalian kingdom. And believe it or not, this sensitivity to effort has profound, though often unexplored, it has profound implications for innovation. To see that, I want to share with you. This is an example. This is some informal research that we have gathered. So we approached people on the street, and so we'd go to maybe Phoebe and Jonathan, and we'd say, "Phoebe, can I have 5 minutes of your time? And Phoebe, if you grant me 5 minutes of your time, I am going to donate money to the local dog shelter." And then we would ask Jonathan the same thing. "Jonathan, could we have 5 minutes of your time? And Jonathan, if you say yes, we will donate money to the Chicago Herpetological Society." I don't know if anyone knows what herpetology is. It would be quite reasonable for you not to. It is the study of reptiles and amphibians. Now, what do people care more about, dogs or frogs? People care overwhelmingly more about dogs than frogs. It's no contest. And so, what we're looking at here is the rate of yes, the rate of people that said yes to this request. And not surprisingly, far more people are inclined to honor the request when it is a dog level initiative than when it is a frog level initiative. And in this example, we are seeing the benefits of fuel. Right, in the conventional approach to creating change, to bringing new ideas into the world, we are trying to elevate appeal. We're trying to show people, no, no, this is not a frog level initiative. This is really a dog level initiative. And what we are seeing here is that fuel works. But let's look at what happens when we change the scenario slightly. Let's look at what happens when now it's not a 5-minute ask, it's a 20-minute ask. Well, not surprisingly, rates go down, but the difference between these two groups all but evaporates. Now, does this mean that this sample of people don't care more about dogs than frogs? Is that what we should conclude from this? By the way, sidebar, one of the things we know from this, there is a group of people out there who will say yes to everything. It's what I call chronically compliant. But other than that, no one says yes to this. And the reason no one says yes to this is what we would call a crowding out effect. It's because the only Phoebe, Jonathan, I suspect you do not have 20 minutes of slack built into your morning commute. If I stop you on the street, it doesn't matter what the cause is. We could be saving children's lives, but you got a meeting you have to get to. You don't have 20 minutes to offer me. The point is, what we are seeing here is even when we value the idea, even when the idea is highly fueled, if the implementation cost is great, we often reject new, unquestionably better ideas, not because they lack fuel, that they lack appeal, but rather the implementation cost is too great. So, one way we might start thinking about building more aerodynamic ideas before we launch a new idea, we might ask ourselves, how can we make the action we want people to perform easier? And one of the reasons we get this wrong, we neglect this, like we understand this, it's an intuitive idea at some level, but what we get wrong is how even small changes to the effort calculus can have extraordinary impact, asymmetric impact on behavior. So, this is a somewhat famous example. You're looking at organ donation rates across Europe around the year 2000. Notice this is a very odd distribution. You have a set of countries like the US that are appallingly low. And then you have a set of countries that are near universal. And notice this is not a north-south thing. It's not a Scandinavian Mediterranean thing. It is not a historically Protestant Catholic thing. Like, what is driving this? In the countries where it is near universal, you are born into the world assumed a donor. Now, in every one of these countries, you can get off the registry. That is your right. You just have to take an active step. In the countries where it is quite low, you are born into the world assumed a non-donor, and you have to take an active step. Now, notice, uh, is that a complicated step? Does it mean setting up a meeting at the consulate or the embassy? No, it is a simple step. But people, generally speaking, follow the easiest path. Now, in some contexts, like in UX design in certain areas, maybe in consumer behavior, people are somewhat attuned to this sensitivity. But there are a lot of areas where what we tend to think about, like how do we get people to buy into us and our ideas, we think about the fuel and the magnetism and how do we amplify the fuel. But we spend very little time thinking about the effort and cost of implementation. Uh, Maybe the challenge I work on most is leaders saying, our team, our people, our company, we need to innovate more. This is one of the things I hear. Another one is we're too siloed. I hear a lot collaboration. I hear a lot innovation. And if you ask them, well, how are you doing that? Like, what is your attempt to innovate? How are you trying to spur, increase innovation? You hear conventional things like sometimes it's incentives. Very often, what it is kind of hand wringing, emotional appeals. I'm telling people how critical it is to innovate. A great question we like to ask leaders when this is their problem, when this is their challenge. How exactly do people innovate? Or we'll ask people in companies, so can you lay out for us in clear detail. Imagine you want to create something new. When does that happen? Is innovation a Tuesday morning, 9 a.m. affair? If it requires collaboration, who initiates that? What room do we have to meet in? What are the logistics around that? Very often, what we'll find, we'll ask people three questions. One, how important do you think innovation is? Two, do you know in instrumental, practical, tangible ways how to do it? And three, how much time do you spend actually innovating? What we find is people's attitude. Nobody thinks this is a bad idea. This is a self-evidently good, important idea, innovation. What we find, that belief around innovation, the level to which we think it's important, attractive, appealing, has very little to do with how much people actually innovate. Often the real magic is the issue of how do I go about doing it? Like if you were to ask Kellogg, deans are always telling Kellogg faculty, you got to create new classes. If you were to ask a Kellogg faculty, imagine you have a new class idea. What's the roadmap for doing that? What's the first step, second step? What are the logistics to creating a new class? Most can't tell you. But if you showed them a roadmap, if you removed those barriers, I suspect you would find that would be far more effective than just simply talking about the fuel of doing so. So, one way, one strategy for making, so let's imagine you diagnose the frictions operating against you and you think it's effort. And notice here, effort isn't just like physical effort, like picking up a heavy object. In a professional context, it's often complexity and ambiguity. A lot of things, like often what looks to be resistance on the surface is really just ambiguity. People don't really know how to do what you're asking them to do. So once you spot effort as a potential issue, you might then begin to think about what are ways I can streamline the process. That might involve removing points of friction, keeping in mind that often small changes have a huge impact, or how can we give people a roadmap? How can we remove the ambiguity or uncertainty? Because that is a form of effort. To leave off on this point, and then I want to turn it over to you. Uh, Let me show you, and I know this is quite rightly an eye-rolling comment, uh, but to show you the power of effort uh, and its importance, I think this principle of removing effort can change your life. This has changed my life. I am going to remove a very big problem for all of you right now, because I suspect everyone in the room has the following problem. I bet everyone in this room faces this challenge of you want to be a helpful, altruistic colleague. You want to help people, but if you say yes to all the requests you receive, you become overrun and you face this challenge. And I suspect what a lot of us do, particularly the culture here, is you say yes too often and you wear yourself thin. If this is a challenge you face, I am going to resolve this challenge for you forever, just using this sort of friction removal approach, this effort assessment approach. I got this from a really influential Silicon Valley entrepreneur by the name of Heidi that some of you may know. This is a rule that she lives by. I heard her share once. I've now adopted it. I call it the Heidi rule. You might use it as well. And the basic idea is this. So imagine someone asks for your time. Kalina, imagine I ask for 30 minutes of your time for coffee, and suppose you genuinely want to say yes. The Heidi rule is say yes, but require that people take the first step. Imagine someone asks, imagine I come to you and say, hey, would you be willing to give me feedback on my resume? If you want to help, you might say yes, but make them take the first step. So you might say, Loran, Uh, Send me the resume, and just so I can give you better feedback, would you share maybe just a couple paragraphs about your career aspirations so I understand the resume, so I see it in context? When you ask people to take the smallest step, it's Heidi's experience, mine has confirmed it. What happens 8 out of 10, 9 out of 10 times? You will never hear from those people again. And I would argue that if the smallest barrier is too much for people, then those are people who do not deserve your time. Simply by using the effort calculus, it allows you to be oriented on yes, but you can almost perfectly control the amount of demand that is actually placed on your time. A former dean used this really well. Now, this requires a little formal authority, but she would want to differentiate between people who uh, just didn't like a new idea because reflexively we don't like the unfamiliar. That's what we call an inertia-based friction, or those people have legitimate, real, meaningful concern. Well, the way she differentiated between those groups of people was just by monitoring, controlling the effort calculus. So what she began to do is create listening tours. So if you've got concerns about this new initiative, I really want to hear those. Sign up for these breakfast meetings. In her experience, the people that have got that superficial sort of light level resistance just because maybe they have to overcome something new, what do? They follow the path of least resistance, which is to go along with the change. Those who've got meaningful concerns make the time. So you can use this to really separate the people who've got meaningful concerns and those who really just don't truly value your time. All right. Um, so there is so much more to friction theory, the ideas here. Uh, I really want to hear what you're thinking about. So why don't I pause? I'm in fact going to put up this slide so we can see the four frictions: inertia, effort, emotion, and reactance. I'd love to hear what you're thinking about, and why don't we turn it over to you? Um, so the first question I see here from Jonathan, uh, great question. Does it take effort to remove effort? So you're shifting the effort to someone else. Uh, so what I would say is this brings up a really essential point, which is when you think about frictions, uh, often this exercise can be most valuable uh, when you anticipate frictions rather than responding once the idea, the product, the initiative has been launched. So, what we would recommend is before you launch your idea, uh, you take time, just take some time to analyze what are the likely frictions operating here. Does that take effort? Certainly, it takes effort, and I hope you calibrate, uh, process time to importance. But it's not necessarily greater effort. All we're simply asking of you is rather than simply thinking about how do we elevate the magnetism of our idea, also thinking about what are the potential barriers here and how can we remove them. And if you shine a light on them, uh, like if you think back to those two case studies, it's not true. Sometimes frictions are hard to spot, sometimes they are buried. But very often, once we simply shine a light on that blind spot, like what the mind isn't naturally seeing, now often the solutions become quite apparent. Uh, so does that require some effort? It does, because it requires us to really shift our mindset from fuel to friction. Requires so a fuel-based mindset is really fixated on the idea itself. To really understand frictions, we have to shift our attention from the idea and the audience, and that does indeed require a little bit of effort. But I would argue that often it's going to save us a lot of time and headaches down the road if we can anticipate these frictions and remove them before we try and launch our idea. Great question.
Well, cool. Lauren, I'm just jumping back in here. Jonathan beat me to the first question. It was such a good one that I didn't want to hop in there. But I think on behalf of everybody, we want to just say thank you for taking the time to share your principles with us. For those, again, who'd like to learn more, I do suggest picking up a copy of your book, The Human Element. I, again, really enjoyed it. But as the host, I get the honor of asking the next question, and then we'll turn it back over to everybody else. So, why do you think we think in fuel? Maybe you can just expand upon that a little bit.
Yeah, so that is a great question. Why does why is this a habit of the mind to have a fuel-based mindset? Uh, so it has to do with this really interesting aspect of our psychology of human nature, and it has to do with how we explain behavior. So the reflex of the mind is to explain behavior, to attribute action or behavior in terms of internal forces like motivation and intent. So a good way to understand this, the classic example is the angry driver. So imagine you're on the highway and a driver cuts you off. They're driving way too fast, erratically, recklessly. Think about what is your first automatic reflexive attribution. Like, what is it you think about that person? The first attribution is probably, this driver is a jerk, or whatever version of that you would use. Uh, Notice a jerk, that is an internal orientation. That is a stable internal trait about that person. What probably never occurs to you, what is much less salient, is a situational attribution like, oh, maybe that driver has a full bladder. And this attribution style of understanding action and behavior in terms of internal forces like intent and motivation, it perfectly maps onto fuel. So imagine you launch a new idea and it's not producing the intended results. Well, the reflex of the mind is, well, if people aren't buying in, it must be because excitement is insufficient. And if that's the attribution your mind creates, well, how do you solve that problem? You solve that problem by elevating appeal. Fuel does that job. And that is there are other reasons why. That is a big reason why we think in fuel. The second reason why is we have to shift attention from the idea to the audience, and that requires perspective taking. It requires, depending on the context, us knowing our audience, us knowing our context, and that's often a richer analysis than just thinking about, the product.
I think that's really interesting. So maybe before we go to another audience question, one of the things you said is, getting our managers and our leaders to become more comfortable with the uncomfortable, or the unfamiliar, I believe is what you said. I would love to know if you have any kind of tips or tricks what are some ways that we can help overcome that feeling of uncomfortableness and help to promote our own ideas.
Yeah. So this is and I would say, so if you're doing this analysis, this is a great question. Now we've shifted our attention onto the first friction, which is inertia. So inertia is the idea that the human mind is naturally favors the familiar over the unfamiliar. And to see that first, to see the human behavior of that. So imagine you are on a deserted island, and there are two fruits, right? You're stranded, shipwrecked, deserted island, dire straits, and you find two fruits growing in abundance. One's bananas, and they don't look as nice as grocery bananas, but clearly bananas. And the other is some fruit you have never seen before. It's maybe bright orange with spikes. You cut it open, the inside is this kind of green and flesh. It smells of cucumber. Which one of those do you choose, at least from a maybe Western lens? Well, to the survivalist, the choice is obvious. You go with what you know. the human mind is hardwired to favor familiar because the familiar signals safety. It signals that you have survived your encounter with this thing in the past, and it steers you towards the familiar option. I just did some informal work. So we asked people, think about the music that you grew up with. So for me, that would be like Nirvana, grunge, 90s era music. Think about the music of your generation and the music of the generation before and after it. And we asked them, which of those three things, which music do you prefer? Do you like best? And which do you think is objectively better? Not surprisingly, people overwhelmingly, it's like 85% of people say the music of my generation is the stuff I like best. But also at almost the identical same rate, those people think their music is objectively better than the generations before and after. This is obviously nonsense, but it's not, we favor it not because it's objectively better, it's because it's what we know. Now, if your idea, so if in your analysis you think the psychological friction operating against this idea is that this is radical change, seismic change. There are a number of ways we can reduce that friction. Some are more intuitive, like if you're doing a transformation, a good idea is to not call it a transformation. There are a number of techniques, but I'd like to share a far less intuitive technique. I think a particularly powerful technique for combating inertia. This is one of my favorites. And what we'll see when the fuel-based mindset leads us to have some really faulty uh, influence intuitions. And so in the conventional approach to bringing new ideas into the world, here's what we do. So imagine what you're trying, here's some technology that you're trying to get people to buy into. This is what you're selling. In the conventional approach, like this is a group that's, you've never used this, you believe in it, you think this will make us better, you sell, you've got your functional reasons why, etc. In the conventional approach to influence, what people do is they put this thing in front of their audience and they try and add fuel. They try and elevate appeal, excitement, etc. Now, the problem with this approach is that humans understand the world in relative terms. So follow me on a really quick thought experiment here. So imagine you're at, I don't know, the Nike store and you find some items you want to buy. When you go to check out, the cashier makes an unexpected offer. The cashier says, I don't know if you know this, but there is a Nike discount store about 5 blocks from here. And in my inventory, I can see the items you intend to purchase are available there. This $300 purchase you're about to make, if you buy it at the discount store, you would save $50. All right, so think about your reaction to that unexpected offer. Now, a second thought experiment. Imagine you're car shopping. You find the car you want, you're ready to put pen to paper when the salesperson makes an unexpected offer. Salesperson says, I don't know if you know this, but there is another showroom about 5 minutes drive from here. And in my inventory, I can see we have this very same car there. Same make, same model. If we put the two together, you couldn't tell them apart. This $30,000 car you're about to purchase, if you were to buy it at the showroom over, you would save $50. If you work with me here, I'm trying to create an example where effort is roughly equal. And to the extent that is true, a rational agent would value those two offers equally, right? $50 is $50. I can have a solid night at a dive bar on $50. But I am almost certain that you had very different reactions to those two offers. I suspect in the context of 300, that's generous. I suspect in the context of 30,000, it's either puzzling, amusing, or insulting. What you are seeing there is the power of relativity. Relativity is the idea that we understand the world in relative terms. We understand ideas and options in relative terms. Now, think about how the conventional approach to influence, innovation, and change neglects this fundamental reality. In the conventional approach to creating change, we put one thing in front of people and we try and elevate appeal. But when you are putting one idea in front of people, it turns out there is, in fact, an implicit point of comparison. Imagine your audience has never used this. You're telling them about the benefits, it's going to make us more effective, efficient, etc. Think about what people, at least implicitly, unconsciously, compare this new innovative thing against. They compare it against the status quo. Like in the conventional approach to creating change, to selling ideas, uh, notice when we sell people on a new idea, the mind at some level is comparing the new against what is known, what is comfortable, what is familiar. And unfortunately for the innovator, that is a friction because the human mind favors the familiar over the unfamiliar. That means anytime you're giving people one option, it's a good indicator, and you're using fuel to elevate it. It is a good indicator that inertia's likely working against you. But here's the good news. Here's how you could leverage the power of relativity. This is a sort of friction oriented approach to change rather than a fuel based approach. Time you hear yourself offering people one path, one option, you might think, inertia is likely working against me because I'm allowing people to compare the new unknown against the comfortable, traditional, familiar thing. What we want to do instead is start putting our ideas in a more favorable context. And there is nuance to this that we get into in the book, but let me offer just one simple way you might do this. So anytime you hear yourself giving people one option, you might think, can I create multiple options that are more favorable points of comparison? And one great way to do this is to add more ideal or more extreme options. An example that comes to mind, this was a group, they were trying to get people to sign, they were in the commercial waste management business. They were trying to get people to sign up with them, and what they wanted long-term contracts. But the way they structured the contract is what they required was a minimum of a 1-year deal. And what did the vast majority of people do? Of course, they signed up for 1-year deals. So in other words, the choice here was between, do I maintain the status quo or do I sign this 1-year deal with an unfamiliar group? They reevaluated this approach, looking at it through the lens of friction and relativity, and they made a pivot. The pivot they made was to start offering 1, 3, and 5-year deals. And the moment they did that, now all of a sudden, people had a very different understanding. Now all of a sudden, people began, a lot of groups signed up for the 3-year deal, but also more people were inclined to sign up for the 1-year deal because by having more extreme, more ideal options, people weren't just thinking about status quo versus new. It casts attention away from this sort of comparison of familiar versus unfamiliar, and it focuses attention on which of these new innovative ideas do I like best. Final point here. So this was huge for them. And my question to them was, well, if having companies sign up for 3-year deals, if that's so beneficial to you, why wouldn't you have done that from the beginning? And their response speaks to another vital, faulty influence intuition many of us hold. Their answer was, we feared we were asking for too much. Often what we are doing is we have an ideal sense of what we want, but we remove ideal because we fear it's asking for too much. And what we give people instead is the realistic choice. It's still a win, but it's a somewhat compromised win. So one practical but powerful way you might start breaking down inertia is anytime you find yourself tempted to follow this instinct of giving people just the realistic instead of the idealistic option, the easy change here might be to say, leave idealistic on the table, make it a salient point of comparison, because now it shifts people's attention away from the unfavorable comparison of, do I like the thing I know that's comfortable, that's familiar, versus this new unknown, versus which of these innovative ideas do I like best?
Well, I think that is an excellent point to end on, and a very important lesson for many of us here. So big thank you again to you, Loran, for sharing these insights with us. I'm sure many of us will take these back to our day jobs and start to apply them. Thank you again, and we hope everybody enjoyed this talk at Google.
Thank you so much for your time and attention. This has been amazing. Please reach out. Please reach out.